Fairies are a race of winged magical creatures that have appeared in every single game of the Zelda series. Fairies have a hierarchical society composed of various types of fairies of many shapes and sizes, and in today's video we will go over each type, from least to most powerful. Firstly, there are the lowest class of fairies, known as small fairies, being the most common type of fairy found in the world. They tend to group together in fairy fountains, although some of them are found by breaking jars or cutting grass. As seen in Ocarina of Time, if a butterfly touches a Deku stick, the winged insect would immediately transform into a fairy. Similar to this, certain monsters such as Bubbles and Sparks would also turn into fairies if sprinkled with magic powder or struck with a boomerang. In Skyward Sword, by drawing a Triforce symbol on a goddess wall, small fairies would be summoned to aid the hero. Small fairies possess the ability to heal, being able to restore health to those in need. As they are so tiny, these fairies can be caught in empty bottles to be used at a later time to heal the user. If the one who captured the fairy falls in battle, the bottled fairy would come out to revive him. Small fairies are divided into several types. First, we have what's known as fairy spirits. These small fairies resemble glowing orbs of varying colors with 4 wings. Aside from being able to heal, they also serve as travel companions, providing advice on how to continue on the adventure, as well as how to defeat enemies. First appearing in Ocarina of Time, fairy spirits serve as guardian fairies for the Kokiri, the children of the forest. Link, the hero of Time, as he was a Hylian, was not granted a fairy despite being raised as a Kokiri. However, as the fate of Hyrule was threatened by Ganondorf, the Deku Tree sent Navi, a blue fairy, to aid Link on his quest to save the kingdom. After defeating Ganondorf and being sent back in time by Princess Zelda to relive his childhood, Navi left Link's side for unknown reasons, which would kickstart Link's personal journey to find her, leading to Majora's Mask. In Majora's Mask, the mischievous Skull Kid had 2 fairy companions, Tattle, a yellow fairy, and Tail, a purple fairy, 2 fairy siblings he met in a parallel world of Termina, who became his close friends. After ambushing Link, stealing his ocarina and his Tira Epona, and cursing him into the form of a Deku Scrap with the powers of Majora's Mask, the Skull Kid unknowingly left one of his fairy companions, Tattle, behind, who would become Link's new companion in Termina, and who would aid the hero in stopping the moon from falling. In Oracle of Seasons, while regular fairies took on more human-like forms, the season spirits resembled the orb forms of fairy spirits, each of a different color representing their respective seasons, those being autumn, spring, summer, and winter, each spirit housed within one of the 4 corners of the Temple of Seasons. The great fairies in 4 Swords and Minish Cap, before revealing their true form, showed themselves as the orb-like fairies, while the other small fairies were more human-like. In 4 Swords Adventures, the Shrine Maidens turned into fairy spirits when freed from the crystals, although these fairies, in contrast to the others of their type, had 2 wings instead of 4. In Twilight Princess, fairies were found hidden across the world, all sharing a pink glow. After completing certain levels in a Cave of Ordeals, the Great Fairy would begin to send fairies to each of the 4 Light Spirit Springs. The Fairy of Winds is a fairy that appears in Twilight Princess, being a fairy that resides within a Gale Boomerang. While not seen directly, only hearing her voice, it can be speculated that she may be a fairy spirit, as not only are the fairies in Twilight Princess all fairy spirits, but these kinds of fairies sometimes may control a particular element, although it is also possible that it is a great fairy, but there is no real way of knowing. In Phantom Hourglass, the servant spirits of the Ocean King, this being Leaf, the spirit of power, Neri, the spirit of wisdom, and Ciela, the spirit of courage and time, as well as the spirit of healing from spirit tracks, all take on the form of fairy spirits, the former three serving as companions to the Hero of Winds on his quest to save Tetra and defeat Bellum. Ciela was split in two prior to the game's events, in order to save herself from Bellum. While one half managed to escape, her other half was captured and sealed away within the Temple of Courage, alongside the other spirits who were also sealed within the Temple of Fire and the Temple of Wind. In Skyward Sword, pink orb-like fairies make a return, hiding in pots and, like mentioned before, summoned by drawing a Triforce symbol on Goddess walls. And in Breath of the Wild, they once again make a return, showing up as pink orbs of light with wings. Then we have humanoid fairies. These resemble small Hawaiian girls with wings on their backs and insect-like antennas, carrying a small one. They appear in many games of the series, even alongside the fairy spirits. They first appeared in the original Legend of Zelda, healing Link whenever he needed, later reappearing in The Adventure of Link. Curiously, in The Adventure of Link, by using the fairy spell, Link could turn himself into a fairy, similar to how the maidens turn themselves into fairy spirits in Forza's Adventures, perhaps an indication that they used the same spell. Small fairies in A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, both Oracle games, A Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes will continue to be humanoid in shape and possessing insect-like antennas. There exists a variant of these human-like fairies that exists in Hyrule, known as Force Fairies, and while they serve the same purpose of healing weary travelers, they don't possess antennas like the previous iterations. Appearing in Forza's Adventures, these fairies are identical in appearance to those found in The Wind Waker and the Minish Cap, being small Highland girls dressed in a white dress with blonde hair tied in two bands. And although the ones from The Wind Waker and the Minish Cap are not called Force Fairies, their identical design may indicate they are actually one and the same. Their name originates from their ties to Force Gems, the crystallized form of Force, a form of energy that resides in all living beings. In Forza's Adventures, if the four links had gathered 1,000 Force Gems by the end of the level, the Force Gems would transform into a Force Fairy, although Force Fairies may also be found while traversing the levels. In The Wind Waker, aside from the regular fairies found across the Great Sea, two distinct fairies of this type appear upon meeting the Queen of Fairies, which grant Link the power to imbue his arrows with fire and ice. What makes these fairies distinct from the other human-like fairies in my eyes, aside from not having antennas, is the fact they remain in their human-like forms when trapped inside a bottle, unlike the ones from A Link Between Worlds, where the captured fairies resemble a fairy spirit. Similarly, in Link's Awakening, the bottled fairies resemble orbs of light. What this may entail is that the humanoid fairies with antennas and the fairy spirits are one and the same, the fairy spirits being a form they take when they glow brightly, while the Force Fairies are separate entities, as they don't seem to glow. The reason as to why the ones with antennas may glow is likely due to the fact they are more closely tied to insects, often being mistaken for fireflies as mentioned in Breath of the Wild. The great fairies from Minish Cap, who turn into fairy spirits, all share names related to insects. The Great Mayfly Fairy, the Great Butterfly Fairy, and the Great Dragonfly Fairy. And, as mentioned before, in Ocarina of Time, if a butterfly touched a Deku Stick, the winged insect would immediately transform into a fairy. Furthermore, in Triforce Heroes, a material called a Mock Fairy is described to be conjured up by fairies when threatened to be used as a decoy, which curiously enough looks like an insect. Next, we have Big Fairies, known in Japanese as Ball Fairies. These small fairies appear in Ocarina of Time on Majora's Mask, resembling big orbs of light without wings. By playing the ocarina near a place where Navi turns green, a big fairy will appear, which will restore 8 hearts and refill the magic meter. Unlike the small fairies, it cannot be caught in a bottle. Curiously, in the craze of Ocarina of Time, the 6 sages fly over the celebrating citizens of Hyrule in the forms of big orbs of light, each being a color representing their respective elements. It is possible that the sages took on the forms of big fairies to travel quicker, similar to the maidens from Four Swords Adventures who took on the forms of fairy spirits. Another thing to note is how a spirit is portrayed in spirit tracks. When Zelda's spirit was separated from her body, before taking on her Hylian form, her spirit resembled a white orb. And at the end of spirit tracks, the Locomos became spirits before returning to the heavens, each being an orb of light colored to represent their respective elements, much like the sages from Ocarina of Time. Next, there are stray fairies, portions of a shattered great fairy, their colors depending on the fairy fountain they belong to. They first appear in Majora's Mask, the 5 great fairies having been fragmented by the mischievous mask-wearing Skull Kid. When returned to their respective fairy fountain, the great fairies will be revived, granting Link a special power. In Oracle of Ages, the stray fairies are known as forest fairies. This time around, they are more mischievous, changing the topography of the fairies' woods of Labrina. After playing a game of hide and seek and locating the 3 fairies, the forest is returned to normal and the young hero is granted access to the Winged Dungeon. And finally, in Four Swords, the stray fairies appear in the Chamber of Insight, giving Link advice on how to progress forward. Governing over the small fairies, we have the far more powerful Great Fairies, large humanoid fairies often much larger in size than a regular Hylian. Like small and big fairies, these fairies are able to heal Link and restore his magic meter. They also grant travelers with special items, powers, or even upgrade their equipment. Most great fairies can be found living within a great fairy fountain, accompanied by small fairies. They all vary drastically in appearance from game to game, the reason as to why their appearance changes so drastically between games not being clear. In A Link to the Past, and its sequel A Link Between Worlds, great fairies resemble large humanoid Hylian women with wings and antennas, often found inside small caverns where their fairy fountains are hidden. At the Waterfall of Wishing near Sora's Waterfall, there lives a great fairy known to be a friend of the fairy queen named Venus. Another great fairy is found in a dark world within a pyramid of power, known as the Cursed Fairy, having grown in size after being cursed by Ganon. She asks Link to defeat Ganon in order to return to her true form, granting Link the silver arrows necessary to deal the final blow to the Demon King. In Link's Awakening, and later Oracle of Ages and Seasons, which use the same sprites, great fairies still resemble humanoid girls with wings and antennas, although having black hair instead of being blonde, most being found within great fairy fountains. In Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, 4 great fairies appear before Link, named the Great Fairies of Magic, Power, Wisdom, and Courage, with a 5th fairy named the Great Fairy of Kindness appearing in Majora's Mask, who grants Link the Great Fairy Sword. It is in these 2 games where the Great Fairies began to change drastically in appearance in comparison to the other games, resembling large wingless humanoid women who wear ivy vines and leather boots for clothing, having red hair tied into 3 pigtails. In Four Swords, the Great Fairies once again resemble giant winged women, each of the 3 being a unique color representing their unique elements, these being the Great Fairy of Forest, the Great Fairy of Ice, and the Great Fairy of Flame. Unlike the previously mentioned winged fairies, these great fairies don't have antennas, instead having crowns resembling antennas. These great fairies would each grant the 4 Links a key that would open the way to the Palace of Winds, where Vati, the Wind Mage, had taken Princess Zelda. The great fairies in the Minish Cap looked identical to those found in Four Swords, these being the Great Mayfly Fairy, the Great Butterfly Fairy, and the Great Dragonfly Fairy. As Minish Cap is a direct prequel to Four Swords, it is possible that the fairies in both games are one and the same. In The Wind Waker, there are 7 great fairies, who once again change drastically in appearance compared to their previous incarnations, being wingless, looking less human-like, and having 4 arms. One of these great fairies appears to the hero after defeating a giant octorok at the Two-Eyed Reef, while another, known as the Fortune Goddess, resides within the Forest of Fairies in Outside Island. This design reappears once again in Forza's Adventures, the fairies found within caves and certain dungeons. In Twilight Princess, a single great fairy appears within a Cave of Ordeals, in the fountains found every 10 levels. After completing each level, the Great Fairy would send fairies to each of the 4 spirit springs from Hyrule, and filling one of the hero's bottles with Great Fairy's tears after completing the 50th floor. In Breath of the Wild, only 4 great fairies appear, named Kotera, Kaisa, Mija, and Terra, who would upgrade Link's armor in exchange for materials. These fairies are found in Great Fairy fountains that appear as closed flower buds, which open after Link offers an amount of rupees to each one. While not referred to as a fairy, there exists a being known as Malania, the horse god, who lives in a hidden fairy fountain near Faron Woods, which, like the other fairies, requires Link to offer rupees to open. Malania, being a horse god, has the power to revive horses who have died in the land in exchange for Endura carrots. Curiously, Malania's name in Japanese is Maran, almost identical to Malon from Ocarina of Time, who is also named Maron in Japanese, perhaps a reference to the young ranch girl who taught the hero upon a song taught to her by her mother, which happens to play when you talk to Malania, furthering the connection. And finally, we have the strongest of all fairies, the one who rules over them all, the Queen of Fairies, who also changed drastically in appearance between games. In A Link to the Past, there exists a fairy queen named Venus, who resides within the Pond of Happiness inside a cave on the island in the middle of Lake Hylia. In Link's Awakening, a fairy queen makes an appearance at the end of the Color Dungeon, granting Link the power of color by changing his green tunic to either a red tunic, which will increase the offense of Link's weapons, or a blue tunic, which will increase his defense against attacks. In Oracle of Ages, the Queen of Fairies is the guardian of the Sora Sea, although she was cursed into the form of an octorok by the evil Veran, only being able to be returned to normal if sprinkled with fairy powder. This fairy queen looks identical to the other great fairies, the only difference being she's red instead of yellow. In Wind Waker, the Queen of Fairies appears to be a child, but she's much greater and much more powerful than the great fairies, grabbing one of them as if she were a doll. After meeting her atop the Mother and Child Isles, the Queen of Fairies would grant Link with the power to add fire and ice to his arrows. Curiously, the design of Fi, the spirit residing within the Master Sword in Skyward Sword, was based on the design of the Queen of Fairies from Wind Waker. Whether this is an indication of a connection between the two is yet to be confirmed. In Forza's Adventures, the Queen of Fairies makes a return during the Hyrule Castle level, resembling her appearance from Wind Waker, but in a much smaller size. She had heard the captured maiden's cries for help, and rushed to the castle only to find it overrun by monsters, who captured her and split her into 2 Soras. After asking the 4 Links for help, they reunited her with her other half, returning her to her true form. And with her powers restored, she destroyed the magic barrier and soldiers guarding the entrance to the castle. The queen then promised the heroes she would tell the other great fairies to aid them when in need. And that were the fairies explained. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to get notified of future uploads. Also, consider following me on Twitter and Instagram to stay in touch. This has been Zelda Lore, and I'll see you in the next video.